Okay, so let's begin this session. I think this is going to take forward the discussion that Jeff started. We're very lucky to have three great speakers with us. First of all, Ambassador Geir Pedersen, who is Norway's permanent representative to the UN. He's also the co-chair of the third International Conference on Financing for Development on Addis, which is clearly one of the great strategic moments in 2015. He's got the very straightforward, not to say simple, task of framing an agreement between 189 countries in a 20-page document, which so we look forward to hearing from you about that. Our second speaker, who we're really delighted to have with us, is Aggrey Tisa Sabuni, who until recently I think was finance minister of South Sudan, but is now economic advisor to the president. And I think, having spent some time with you in South Sudan, I think it's one of the countries that illustrates both the huge challenges and the immense opportunities that Jeff was outlining. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from you. And the third speaker will be our very own Romilly Greenhill, who's actually producing our flagship publication for the Addis conference, and she'll be speaking about that work and the role of international public finance in development. So let me pass over to each of you. Have 10 minutes. I have to keep the time quite strictly, so which I'll endeavour to do. Ambassador.
Let me know when I have 2 minutes to go. Okay. Wonderful. Really a pleasure being here. And since Jeff talks so much about China, let me also start with the China history. When I was a rather young diplomat, many, many years back, in 1988, in January actually 1988, I had the pleasure of being in a meeting with Deng Xiaoping in Beijing with my then Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. And Brundtland was at the time working on our common future. So it was a great meeting with Deng Xiaoping and with Gro, as we call her. And what was the focus on the meeting? One thing: economic growth. How could China develop to become what it should be? A leading nation, fighting poverty, and so on. And looking back, of course, amazing what our Chinese friends have been able to achieve. And thanks to our Chinese friends, basically we've been able to reach the Millennium Development Goal of halving poverty. Let's be honest. It's basically thanks to Deng Xiaoping's visions, how to do this, that we achieved it. Then let's make a big leap to the election of Modi in India last year. And if, we have seen the prognosis that for the first time, most probably this year, India will have an economic growth that will be bigger than China's. It's a remarkable story. So what will be the success of Modi? That will be if he is doing the same as Deng Xiaoping. At the time when I lived in China, 70 to 75% of the energy would come from coal. For Modi, 50% of his energy will come from, relatively speaking, dirty coal, even if compared to China. So if Modi is to be successful the way Deng Xiaoping was successful, and if we are to be successful in 2015, then we have quite a challenge. Because Modi could do the simple thing. He could say, we are building on the energy resources that we have, cheap energy, and I will achieve what is most important for me, and that is fighting poverty. Why shouldn't India do it the same way that China did it? For me, that's the big issue. And we could, also add to that, why shouldn't Africa south of the Sahara do the same way as China did? Well, that's the big challenge for 2015. How can we fight poverty, and how can we fight climate change? And you are here to tell me how I'm to succeed in bringing this process forward. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being here.
It was a genuine question.
It is a genuine question, but it's I'm talking to so many different audiences these days. How many of you have read the Monterey document or the Doha? Wow, really? Well, I'm going to ask a few questions. No, but the reality is that the Monterey Consensus is a remarkably good document, and it gives us actually quite a good basis to start working from. And what is the starting position? It is that development is each and every nation's responsibility. You have North Korea and you have South Korea. I also had the pleasure of visiting both North and South Korea, but I will not bore you with wonderful stories from both places. But just look at the situation in North Korea in the late 1960s and South Korea in the late 1960s. They were very difficult to tell who would be successful. North Korea did a lot of bad decisions. South Korea did very good political decisions. So it's up to the politics. It's up to what kind of decisions do you make. That's sort of the starting point. But then we also know that to be successful, you need what we call then good politics. You need an enabling environment. And obviously, the key issue in Monterey is domestic resource mobilization. It's a starting point. But we also know that to be successful, you don't only need a domestic enabling environment. You don't only need good domestic governance, you also need it at an international level. And that's where we will have the challenge. So we need to continue to mobilize the private sector, which is also in Monterey. Economic growth was a key in Monterey to fight poverty. It was also about the important role of FDI, the important role of ODA, and the ambition of 0.7. It was the important role of trade as an engine for development. And of course, debt was discussed. What do we need? And many, since so many of you have read the Monterey, I don't need to go through. So what are then the issues now? How do we need to develop that? Well, we need to keep the basis. That's the important thing. Then we need to add most probably something more on technology, on innovation, and on capacity building. But I'll get back to that. But what's really the big challenge? The really big challenge is to address the sustainability issue. As Jeff rightly mentioned, it's not that that is something new. But what is new is that in 2015, after Rio, we have to talk about sustainability as something that will have to go deep into all the different elements of a new consensus document that hopefully we will agree on in Addis. And that, for me, is the big challenge. How to get climate sustainability into the document, and how do we end up with something actionable, something that is really that we can deliver. There are a few other minor challenges as well, and maybe I should just mention that. And that is, how do we deal with states in conflict, fragile states? It was there also during Monterey, but we all know that the real challenge in implementing the Millennium Development Goals in fragile states. That's where we have the challenge. And how do we deal with that also when we are fighting poverty and climate change? So it's in particular, how do we mobilize capital for LDCs, for small island states? This is something we have to address. Inequality was also an issue that was discussed at Monterey, but I think it's one of the really big issues. How do we address that? And I know there are quite a few ideas out there, and I think we will hear more about it later on. So in the elements paper that we have introduced already, there are a few things related to that. And then, of course, it was there also during the Monterey, but volatility of the markets. How do we, what is sort of the, can we do something internationally on this, or is this just dreams? And then South-South cooperation. And Jeff mentioned, his challenge to China and to the other emerging markets. It's a big issue, and how we need to get that right. And if we don't get it right, it could backfire. So I would just mention that. So what in our opinion should we concentrate on? ODA should unlock private resources. It should be used efficiently. ODA is a relatively small, 130 billion, but important. But if we compare it with the trillions of dollars out there, we need to make sure that we use ODA in an intelligent manner. So that's extremely important. Infrastructure needs to be a key, and here we, define infrastructure rather broadly. It should include also energy, and on energy, we have some ideas. We can get back to that. Agriculture, we need to think about, coming up with something new, and then as a foundation for all of this and successful development, we know health and education need to be key components. Challenges that I will not address, but will just highlight for you is how do we align this with the climate conference coming up in Paris in December, and how do we work out a relationship with the post-2015 agenda and the 17 goals. Just 2 words on that and I will finish. In my opinion, Goal 17 is basically what we're doing in the Addis conference. If you read Goal 17, it's basically, Monterey light. So this is what we have to work on and deliver. The question is, what do we do with the other 16 goals? And that's why I'm saying we need to look at some of the big cross-cutting issues, like infrastructure, energy, and agriculture. But we're still early days. George Talbot, who I'm working very closely with on this, we will hopefully be able to come out with a zero draft paper by the end of February. And then we're looking forward to a continued close cooperation and discussing this with you. Thank you so much.
Ambassador, thank you. Could I, just before passing on to Mr. Sabuni, ask you, maybe this is an unfair question, so don't feel obliged to answer it, but if you had to identify the 1 or 2 areas where you can see some transformative ideas that might come out of, like practical transformative initiatives that might come out of Addis, what would they be?
I should be a bit careful, since I'm sort of going to co-facilitate this and have to work out compromises. I prefer that good transformative ideas should come from someone else, and I could continue working on it. Those of you who know me well know that we are working on a few ideas, and I hope that we will hear more about that later here today. But I have sort of indicated, I think, the areas where I do believe we have to work on. Obviously, inequality is a big issue. And I think if we address inequality in the right manner, it will appeal both to the least developed countries and to the emerging economies. And of course, it's also of relevance for advanced economies. So that, I think, is a key question. And interesting enough, so far in the discussions we've had in New York, there seems to be a consensus on that. The challenge is, how, as you rightly said, how do we develop this into something that is really deliverable and could be transformative in Addis? But I do believe we have a good chance of doing that.
Okay, thank you. That's both very thoughtful and a very diplomatic answer. But you don't get to be Norway's permanent representative at the UN without certain attributes. Mr. Sabuni, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kevin. Good morning, everybody. My short contribution is basically an appeal for special consideration for fragile states in the context of the coming SDGs. So it's a case for fragile states. Fragile states constitute the group of low or middle income countries who have made the least progress in terms of, or rather during the MDG era. They are countries in which extreme poverty is likely to be increasingly concentrated in the coming era. And this is why. In an era when aid allocations are increasingly being driven by results, it would be tempting for policymakers to focus their efforts on environments where progress is easier rather than devoting their energies and resources for fragile states where returns are at most uncertain and the risks are very high. However, the concentration of inequality and extreme poverty in hard-to-reach fragile states risks undermining regional, if not global, stability. Care needs to be taken in this area. The recent Ebola crisis has been a reminder of how linked we are to the rest of the global system. What do we do? So what happens with international public finance matters quite a lot. For low-income, least developed, conflict-affected, fragile states such as South Sudan, there is a clear and urgent case for both more and better aid delivery. In terms of more aid, infrastructure is probably the most single expensive challenge facing low-income, fragile states right now. By way of example, South Sudan, my country, has just 12 megawatts of installed capacity in the city, in the capital city, Juba, and only one paved road outside of the capital, which is just 200 miles long. Even though our landmass is larger than any country in Western Europe, but only 200 miles of paved road available outside the capital city, and not more than 12 megawatts of installed energy capacity. These were areas that were missing during the MDG era. It is therefore very positive that both infrastructure and energy are now part of the coming SDG era. However, international public finance to fragile states needs to be increased accordingly. If it tries to finance more priorities using the same envelope, it will be unable to make its interventions up to scale, particularly in terms of infrastructure, and they will risk the undermining of the fragile gains so far made in terms of service delivery. In terms of better aid, it is clear that a country as fragile as South Sudan, sustainable development is contingent on peace building and state building, key components in the New Deal arrangement. This was an intuition that was entirely lacking during the MDGs era. It is therefore a positive step that goal number 16 of the coming SDGs is proposed to focus on peaceful and inclusive societies. But as the New Deal between the G7 plus group of fragile states and all the major development partners recognized, we need to improve how aid is delivered if we are to achieve peace. Too many decisions on where and how aid is spent, unfortunately, are still pre-decided in donor capitals. Too little aid is spent using national systems, accounting, and whatever it is, procurement laws, and so on. This undermines accountability relationships between the state and its people and delays the development of national systems such as health care. The Ebola crisis highlighted how much this matters. And the other day I was hearing, as Ebola recedes, the infrastructure that came up, there's now the question of what to do with it, because the requisite capacity to handle has not been developed. I think this one is a clear case in point. Too many times aid flows are interrupted by shocks. The dramatic fall in oil prices is another case in point. Yet, we do know the path towards sustainable development in fragile states is not linear. It's quite complicated. In terms of better aid, I would want to cite the case of domestic revenue mobilization as a case in point. And there is none other, there's one aspect of better aid that I want to handle or highlight here because it is very close to me. This is the case of domestic revenue. It doesn't feature in the coming SDGs. But I believe international public finance can and should do a lot more to support fragile states to become physically sustainable, each in its own right. In South Sudan, for example, our access to oil revenues in the past led us to neglect the development of our domestic tax base. Given the recent decline in oil prices, we are now paying a heavy price for this particular aspect of neglect. We have recently started to focus more seriously on domestic revenue mobilization, including the establishment of a revenue authority, just like our neighboring countries, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, do, to modernize and professionalize our revenue collecting capacity. However, the reaction of the international community has not been resoundingly positive in this particular drive for a number of reasons. Yet, government's ability to fund its own expenditure is a core attribute to state building and promotes accountability between the state and its citizens. I just want to conclude as follows, that the points have helped to highlight some of the challenges involved in engaging effectively in fragile states such as South Sudan and other members of the G7+ group. The SDGs help lift the focus to include peace and state building goals. It helps to factor the issues of peacemaking and state building into the agenda. But to deliver SDGs in fragile states needs the following, by way of summary. We said more aid is needed rather than less or the same. For infrastructure at scale or in magnitudes that are commensurate with the task, in part to rebuild what has been lost or destroyed. 2, better aid, so that aid is spent on the highest priorities in the country, and that aid doesn't undermine state building. That aid is able to manage the inevitable shocks like the oil crisis, and aid helps to build domestic revenue. Finally, if the coming conferences in Addis and New York, aid can deliver real changes in countries like South Sudan, then our efforts today will have been amply repaid. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actually, thank you also. You nailed it exactly at 10 minutes, which was perfect timing. Could I just maybe ask you the same question I asked the ambassador in a slightly different way? That for you, what if you had to say that that there is one thing for South Sudan that could really make a difference that might come out of Addis? What would it be?
The case for infrastructure, roads and energy.
That's very clear. Thank you. I should say also that it's been a huge privilege that we've had colleagues from our Budget Support Initiative here working directly with you over many years. Yeah. It's been a great privilege to have that engagement with you and with your country. So thank you for that. Romilly, over to you.
Okay. Is this microphone on, or do I need to do something?
No, it's on.
Sorry?
I think it's on.
It's on, okay. So I'm going to talk about the role of international public finance in meeting SDG 1. And for those of you who don't know the SDGs off by heart, you probably should, but I'll talk you through what SDG 1 is. Just a couple of things to say before starting off. We are focused on international public finance, and particularly concessional international public finance. So that's largely ODA plus South-South cooperation and other forms of public finance that are provided on ODA terms. That is absolutely not to say that we don't think private resources or non-concessional international public financial resources are not important, but that's just what we're focusing on for the particular purposes of this report. We also are looking particularly at finance. Now, again, we all know policies, means of implementation, and the wider context is important. But again, we can't look at everything. So just those sort of two caveats before I start off around the focus of our work. So, SDG Goal 1, this is obviously from the Open Working Group proposed set of Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 1 is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And that's important. The all its forms phrase is important, and the everywhere phrase is important, as I will say very shortly. And these are some of the sub-targets, again, only proposed at this stage, but this is what is on the current list under that. So obviously there's the issue around eradicating extreme poverty. There's one specifically on social protection, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in my presentation. And there's also critically one on resilience. And I think that's very important, particularly in the context of climate change, which I will come on to. And there's 3 or 4 others, but these were just the ones that I wanted to highlight. Now, I think the headline message from some of the trends that have been done, and these are looking at different scenarios that people have looked at in terms of growth and inequality, is that zero poverty by 2030 does look achievable. These scenarios are based on projecting forward historical growth rates and largely holding inequality constant. So the headline message is we can do it. However, there are significant risks. And I want to talk about 3 risks, particularly here. The first is around growth. Growth has been fairly rapid. We are in an age of plenty. I can't remember what Jeff Sachs' exact expression was. We have seen a lot of progress around growth. However, it may not continue. And actually, if growth rates are slower, we're going to see smaller falls in poverty. Inequality has come up a lot this morning. I think it's an absolutely critical issue. Again, if inequality worsens, as it has done over the last 2 decades, that's going to have big impacts on poverty. And I think your point, Jeff, is that we don't actually know. It's difficult to project these things around inequality. And the third big thing that's not actually included in any of the scenarios that are listed here and in the last diagram is climate. The impacts of climate on poverty, I think, as I'm sure you all know, could be absolutely devastating. And they are actually not included in any of these projections. So what you see in the chart here is these are scenarios just based on the range of options for growth and inequality. And what you can see is that actually in the worst case scenario, there's no real reduction in poverty by 2030. I think, what was the phrase that you used? I can't remember, on how ridiculous it is that we have poverty in the
the
in
anachronism.
the 21st century. If we still have it in 2030, we really will have failed. And what these trends show is that in a good best case scenario, we can do it, but actually the risks are really, really serious. So we need to do something about that. This is a point that I think our colleague from South Sudan made extremely powerfully, but there will be, by 2030, a huge concentration of poverty amongst fragile states. These two graphs, the first one shows poverty according to World Bank figures in 2011, and the bottom, the largest, the one actually that's largest in the 2030 graph, is in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the next graph on the right, the chart, that's 2030, pretty much all poverty will be in sub-Saharan Africa, and that is predominantly in fragile states by 2030. So if we're thinking about IPF for the SDG area, we are very much thinking about IPF in fragile states, which is why your points, I think, were particularly important, and I think the Ambassador mentioned this as well. We also need to think about vulnerable groups. As of now, about 2/3 of poor people are in ethnic minorities, and about 3/4 are in rural areas. They're also young, they're old, they're more likely to be disabled. So we've really got to think about how do we help those people in those vulnerable groups, which is why the poverty in all its forms everywhere is so critically important. Now, growth is critical. I've talked about growth a little bit already, but our argument that actually growth is only part of the solution. I'll just skate over this very quickly in the interest of time, but I can go through a little bit more. We know that the impact of growth on poverty is gradual and uneven. Actually, the impact of ODA, or IPF more broadly, on growth is quite small. The impact of external actors to influence growth is also, the track record is very mixed. And also what I'm going to talk about now around social sector investments, those things can actually help promote growth, and they can help promote the kind of growth that actually will help to reduce inequality and tackle the people at the bottom. So there are obviously a range of things that are needed to try and promote inclusive growth, reduce inequality and poverty. We've heard about infrastructure. What we are actually focusing on our report, not because this is everything that's needed to be done, but just because we needed to focus on something, are social protection, education, health, universal health coverage, and the peace and state building goals. And I want to zero in on the social protection point here a little bit, because I'm sure everybody in this room knows how important education is, how important universal health coverage is. I think that argument is largely won. But I think on social protection, there's still a case to be made. And the evidence is that social protection, when it's done right, can be enormously powerful in lifting people out of poverty. Not only that, it can actually help to promote growth. It can stop people from having to take coping strategies in the case of shocks, which can actually undermine long-term growth. So a coping strategy might be, for example, selling off livestock or taking children out of school in the face of a shock. If you have a social protection mechanism, you can avoid that happening, and you can actually promote longer-term growth and help to ensure that that growth is sustained. There's also evidence on good local multiplier effects from social protection, so particularly cash transfers. If you give people money, they will go and spend it in their local economies. That will help to promote local businesses and so on and so forth. And actually, the income multipliers have been more than 2 in some cases. And even in fragile states, there's good evidence on the benefits of social protection. It's not always easy. We know that. It can be very, very challenging. But there are good examples of where cash transfers and cash for works programs and so on have been very effective in post-conflict situations. So it's a mechanism that can be used across different contexts. I've talked about the peace and state building goals. You've mentioned those, but we need to provide social services in the context of also supporting the wider agenda. Now, for these areas, we need public financing. There's a lot of talk about private financing. Again, nobody is denying that's absolutely critical. But when we look at these big financing numbers, I think you made this point as well, we need to think about how we use the public financing. And actually, the evidence suggests that for these social sectors, it absolutely has to be public financing. Where you've had more private mechanisms or reliance on user fees, it's generally worse and made access much more difficult, particularly for the poorest and the most vulnerable groups of the kind that we're focusing on. And in general, domestic public finance is better. That's often the most effective form of financing, but that's not always sufficient, I think, as we well know. Now, I know that costing is extremely unfashionable in this world. You probably won't agree, but most people think that costing
What
is...
could be more fashionable?
Well, you and I are probably the only people in this world who think costing is helpful. But we have nevertheless...
Not just helpful,
essential.
fun. That's key.
It is fun. So this is some work that some of our colleagues have been doing to feed into the flagship report that Kevin mentioned, was to basically look at what are the financing requirements and the financing gaps. It's a little bit complicated graph to explain, but essentially the blue bar that you've got there shows the maximum revenue that countries could potentially contribute, bearing in mind their potential tax raising capacity. This is not actually what they are raising, but what the IMF and the World Bank say that they could be raising based on their income level, structure of economy, and so on. We're assuming no more than 50% of that can go to these sectors, because obviously governments have other priorities, and the OECD average is around about 50%. So we've said, okay, 50% of existing tax revenues could be spent on these sectors. 50% of existing country programmable aid can be spent on these sectors, again, bearing in mind infrastructure and energy and so on, and other needs. And then we've costed out what you would need for universal cash transfers, universal health coverage, and universal education, primary and lower secondary education. This is drawing on UNESCO and Chatham House and other sources of costings for those sectors. And this is what you get to. You get to an enormous gap for the very lowest income countries. Actually, you can't see the middle income countries here, but most of them could actually do this themselves, which may be a controversial message in some quarters, but actually, if you look at the numbers, that's what it suggests. But an enormous gap at the very low income, and that is often very much fragile states. So there's a big need for international public finance to fill these gaps. You could also do it with other, aviation tax, innovative finance, reducing illicit flows and so on. That's also important. But our focus here is how do you fill this with IPF? We are proposing 3 things that need to happen to IPF to enable it to really help meet this poverty challenge. Firstly, volume and allocation. We need more of it. We've heard a lot about 0.7 and the importance of that. If we met 0.7, we would have enough money to do this and more to spare. So that's really critical. And we also need to allocate it more to the very low-income countries. That's not to say that less concessional IPF isn't important in middle-income countries. We've got another paper, which I will just give a plug to, the roadmap by some of my colleagues that actually talks about the importance of less concessional IPF in middle-income, particularly lower middle-income countries. But the most concessional forms of finance should go to this low-income group. We also need to think about delivery approaches, and again, my colleague from South Sudan has said this very well. We need to have a better, a more adaptive, greater acceptance of risk in fragile states, because that's where the challenge lies. And particularly what I wanted to finish on is that we need some kind of mechanism for long-term financing for social protection, a global fund, which we have provisionally called the Bolsa Familiar Global, based on the Brazilian example, but actually it could be called anything. Essentially, it's a mechanism, a pooled funding mechanism for social protection, which we think should really be could be a key announceable in Addis. And what I've done here is taken some of the criteria for pooled funding mechanisms that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network included in their really helpful report, and said, well, how do they apply to pooled funding for social protection? National ownership and country leadership, absolutely critical. You cannot do this without strong national ownership. Allocation to countries in need. As we've just seen, the allocation of existing IPF is not as pro-poor as it needs to be, so that's absolutely critical. Predictable multi-year funding commitments are also important, because governments won't scale up social protection programs if they think that the money is going to disappear in a year or two's time. So you need to be able to provide long-term commitments so that they can make long-term investments. an important global voice for civil society. This is something I know a lot of CSOs are very interested in, financing for technology transfer. And it is an issue that actually you could expect different actors, private sector, public sector, to engage together and to think about technological solutions and ID cards and biometrics and all the rest of it. So I think there's huge potential for this kind of fund and to give a real boost and profile to what's actually a really effective policy, but one that is really neglected. So I think that's my conclusion. Interested to hear feedback.
Romilly, thank you very much for that. Just two quick thoughts. I think the Bolsa Familia global idea captures something really important, because if you look outside of China, Ambassador, which you mentioned, one of the countries that has simultaneously sustained growth, driven down poverty, and reduced inequality is Brazil. It's actually, in some ways, it's one of the great insufficiently told development success stories of the last 15 years. And I think that arrangement, the Bolsa Familia Fund in Brazil, was a critical part of that. And actually it was built through many of the same processes that Geoff was describing earlier, a clear strategy, building coalitions, acting collectively to resolve a problem. The second observation I wanted to make just before throwing it out to questions is that I think the graph that Romilly was showing is a really important one for a wider reason, and that is that there's sometimes an assumption that progress in development is linear. Then you draw a line from where you've come over the last 15 years on poverty, on school enrollment, on child mortality, and you project it forward. And I think it misses the point that travelling the next mile is more difficult than the mile that you just travelled, and that the closer you get to the last mile, to zero, the more difficult it becomes. And if you think of education, the kids who are out of school now are often out of school, not because there's not a school there, but because they're in labour markets or they're forced into early marriage. So this story, I think, is really about how do you reach the most marginalised and disadvantaged countries and people. It very much relates to the points Mr. Sabuni was making. So what I'd like to do now is to thank the three speakers, first of all, but not to let you go yet, because we're going to have a series of questions. So over to the audience for questions. You're not in the audience, actually, but please.
I wanted to make a comment.
Sure.
First, I thought Romilly's presentation was really great, and want to get the slides. And I think that graph of showing the costing and what's within the national budgets is a fundamental part of wisdom. I want to express at least a reservation or a go slow on the Bolsa Familia universal agenda. I'm rather skeptical, I have to say. And the main reason is that the successes are in middle-income countries with pockets of poverty, not low-income countries with pervasive poverty. And I don't like the idea of a universal cash transfer system in a very poor country. I think it's not the right way to spend scarce dollars. I think the right way to spend scarce dollars is raising the productivity of this large, very poor place through the most basic infrastructure, help with smallholder agriculture, and other inputs rather than cash transfers, which is it is right if the facilities are there, the public goods are there, you're giving money to a household to say, make sure your child's immunized. But what if you have no health system? What if you have no clinic? What if you have no school? So the whole Bolsa Familia transfer to the low-income settings, I think, is not analytically correct or a high priority. The World Bank has grabbed this like nothing else, but that's, to me, World Bank, which is, I wish they would think a little bit more clearly about different conditions. So I just want to really I wouldn't put it as a universal proposition. If you're a middle-income country, if the United States, God, we need a Bolsa Familia. That's great. But if you are a very poor country, the urgencies, the differences are there. I'm not talking about lack of protection, but I'm talking about universal cash transfers. I just wouldn't go down that road at all in the places that I know that are in low-income setting.
Thanks, Jeff. Just to clarify, we won't have an internal debate on the panel,
Yeah.
but I think the argument is it's not advocating for individual low-income countries to either set up these schemes or expand these schemes. It's looking at what could be done through the international aid architecture to support cash transfers to poor households.
Okay.
Which is a slightly different. I
Yeah.
mean, I know. it
I'm
doesn't
just
matter.
concerned.
Sure.
Yeah, let me raise the
Okay,
concern.
concern noted. Now let me throw it open to the floor.